talks between Russia and Western diplomats have ended without a resolution to the standoff in Ukraine. NATO are now saying that they are ready to send troops and reinforcements to Eastern Europe if Russia does invade Ukraine. The Alliance's Secretary General has warned that today. Dr. Alexander Lanoszka is an Ernest Bevin Associate Fellow in Euro-Atlantic Geopolitics at the Council of Geostrategy and joins us on Times Radio this evening. Alexander, hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
A pleasure. I wish it were under better circumstances, really. It's a disappointment, I think, to all involved that these talks didn't reach a conclusion. As it stands, take us back, Alexander, to this. What exactly were the Kremlin asking for?
Their demands have been fairly expansive, as a matter of fact. So it's not just that they want Ukraine not to become a member of NATO, but they've also been demanding for any military assistance to Ukraine be suspended. They've even called for a suspension of all the deterrence and defense measures that NATO has put in place practically since 1997. In fact, some statements coming from the Kremlin have even suggested that NATO should retreat to its borders as of 1997, effectively meaning that all of those countries that have joined in Central and Eastern Europe should basically be jettisoned from the alliance. Of course, the main sticking point is indeed, of course, the status of Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO.
And in as much as they want a sort of guarantee, do they, that Ukraine would never enter the alliance?
That is right. But the problem for NATO is that such a guarantee would actually contravene one of the articles of the Washington Treaty, the founding treaty of NATO. That is to say, Article 10, which more or less provides that any country can join NATO so long as it's willing to do so and it has the unanimous consent of the alliance.
And so NATO's response to that, Alexander, has been a flat-out refusal.
Correct. But the irony is that given the internal opposition within the alliance to having Ukraine as a member, there's actually no real prospect of that really happening. And I think Russia knows this. And so much of this conversation is really a red herring. I'm not really sure that's actually the main issue that's truly driving Russia's decision-making here.
So this is theater on Russia's part?
In some ways, yes. I think the bottom line is that Russian leaders, not necessarily members of its public, have a trouble recognizing or reconciling themselves with the notion that Ukraine is a truly sovereign, independent country capable of crafting its own interior and defense policies. And so we're at this impasse, literally, whereby Ukraine is able to integrate more and more with Euro-Atlantic institutions, but at the same time fight the war with Russia at a fairly low intensity. And so a lot of the levers that Russia has had to influence Ukraine over the years has actually gone down. And I think what's happened is that Russia feels that the only way it can compel Ukraine to accept some sort of settlement on terms favorable to Moscow is by way of using military force.
All right. And in that, I suppose, Latvia and Estonia and some of those Baltic states are really key, aren't they? Their geography, obviously, but their role in this as well. And they've called on NATO to increase their presence in those countries to protect them. Is that right?
That is right. So they're, of course, very much unnerved by these developments. They're geographically very proximate to Russia, as you stated. And indeed, the Biden administration has signaled that if Russia were to further its invasion of Ukraine, that would consider positioning new military forces in the region to contain the Russian threat, as it were.
And that's likely to happen?
Well, considering what has happened in 2014 and thereafter, it's not unreasonable to expect such a development. Back then, I think people were a little more unsure as to whether the United States would really provide new military forces into Europe, but it did just that precisely because of concerns about Russian aggression.
And this is part of a real big picture, isn't it, with Russia, Alexander, and Russia's role in now Kazakhstan as well, and in that region. And we heard from Here in the United Kingdom, the new chief of defence gave an interview to the Times in which he pointed towards the underwater cables that link the UK to the rest of the world. These really important underwater information cables, and how Russia we basically don't have the defences that we need to be able to offset a potential attack on those from Russia. And so will Vladimir Putin be seeing this, Alexander, as just a part of a much wider flex?
It's possible, but I do think that at the end of the day, the issue comes down to the situation in eastern Ukraine. From Russia's perspective, it's unsustainable. They feel, like I said, that their influence is waning, that Ukraine is tilting more and more to the west. They feel that there's a window of opportunity that is closing, whereby they feel the need to use military force in order to get those concessions from Ukraine, which frankly they're not getting. And I think they've overreached to some extent precisely because of all these threats that are happening. I don't know exactly what happened with those undersea cables because, of course, that's in the classified domain. But the NATO response seems to be very much unified, and I think Putin has not really expected that. But at the end of the day, the ultimate decision lies with him. It will probably hinge on his assessment of local circumstances in eastern Ukraine.
How much has the situation in Afghanistan and the US's retreat from the world stage in recent years played into Vladimir Putin's recent defiance?
It's an interesting question. So I'm not entirely sure, but there have been some Russian analysts who have argued that because Biden ripped off the bandage, as it were, and put an end to a very long-standing commitment to Afghanistan, no matter how the actual withdrawal went down, Putin might have felt that the moment was ripe for such an agreement or a grand bargain, as it were, with the United States, sensing in Biden a pragmatic leader who's willing to do away with old shibboleths of American foreign policy and so come to some sort of understanding. But again, like I said just now, I think that stems in part from a misunderstanding. This is an election year in 2022 in the United States. Biden campaign on reinvigorating U.S. alliances. This is not the same world as in 2014. And so it's possible that the withdrawal did inspire Putin to do this, although, of course, the military buildup in Ukraine began beforehand. But I suspect that more local factors had more to do with it than the American withdrawal per se.
Okay, thanks for your insights tonight. Really appreciate it. Dr. Alexander Lanoszka, who is an Associate Fellow at the Council for Geostrategy, with us on Times Radio this